The galaxy had always been vast and full of life, its stars shining brightly in the endless dark. For countless centuries, civilizations grew, fought, and thrived under the watchful eyes of those who lived within it. But as peaceful as the galaxy seemed, it had its quiet corners, forgotten places where no one ever went. Among these remote areas was a small research station, located on the far edge of the galaxy, in a region so distant it was often ignored. It was a place where scientists studied the mysteries of space, collecting data from the vast emptiness around them. For years, the station sent its reports back to the Central Command without incident, operating in isolation, unnoticed by the rest of the galaxy. One day, something changed. At first, it was just a faint signal, a distress call from the research station. It wasn't unusual for these outposts to send automated alerts when their systems malfunctioned. But this time, the signal was different. It carried a tone of urgency. It wasn't a routine request for maintenance or a minor glitch. It was a cry for help. The message was garbled at first, the voice of the station's commander trembling with fear. "We are under attack. Something is here. It's not like anything we've ever seen. Please, anyone, help us." The message was brief, but it sent a shockwave through the galaxy. For a moment, the galaxy's leaders brushed it off. After all, what could be so dangerous in a forgotten corner of space? The station had always been a small, unimportant outpost. Who would want to attack a research facility? The military was already stretched thin, and there was no time to investigate what might have been a simple malfunction. The signal was ignored, filed away with the rest of the unimportant reports. But then, the signal came again. This time, it was louder, clearer. The voice of the commander was desperate, almost frantic. They're here. Whatever it is, it's not stopping. We can't fight it. There's nothing we can do. The transmission cut off abruptly, and the message went dead. For hours, there was no sign of the station. No communication. No response. It was as if it had simply disappeared from existence. The galaxy had no time to react. People went about their business, thinking the situation would resolve itself. After all, there had to be a logical explanation, right? A malfunction, a mistake, something explainable. But even as the galaxy's attention turned elsewhere, something dark was growing. Something was stirring in the deep silence of the stars, and it wasn't content to be ignored. Then, just when the distress call began to fade from memory, a third signal came through. A signal from a second, even more remote outpost. This one, too, was a research station, abandoned for years and left to operate in isolation. The transmission was shaky, distorted, but the message was unmistakable. "We've detected something. It's moving. It's too close, too fast. We can't escape. No one is listening, but it's coming. We're not the only ones out here. Please, help us before it's too late." The galaxy sat in stunned silence. The stations, two of them, located at opposite ends of the galaxy, had sent out distress calls with nearly identical warnings. The coincidence was impossible to ignore. Something was out there, something that the galaxy had never seen before. A feeling of unease settled over the leaders of the galaxy, but still, they refused to take action. False alarms, they called them. Just technical failures, nothing more. But deep inside, the officials knew something was off. The second signal wasn't just a random malfunction. It was a message of warning. A message that no one had taken seriously. Even as they continued to dismiss it, a growing fear began to spread. What if they were wrong? What if the galaxy had made a terrible mistake? Days turned into weeks, and still, no one came to investigate. It wasn't until a third station, a much larger one this time, fell silent that the full weight of the situation began to settle in. The distress signals from this station were even worse than before. The voice of the commander was barely recognizable, gravelly, weak, as if they had been pushed beyond their limits. It's not stopping. We've tried everything. It's relentless. We can't fight it. Please, I beg you, please come. We don't have much time. The message ended with a static burst, leaving a chilling silence behind. The galaxy's leaders, now shaken, had no choice but to act. They sent a fleet to the station, hoping to find some answers, but by the time they arrived, it was already too late. The station was gone. Not destroyed. Not in pieces. Just gone. There was nothing left. No wreckage. No signs of a struggle. No remains. It was as if the station had never existed at all. A sinking feeling washed over the galaxy as the magnitude of what was happening became clear. These weren't just technical failures. These weren't just random accidents. Something was hunting these stations, something that was faster, more powerful, and far more dangerous than anything the galaxy had ever faced. Whatever it was, it had come to the galaxy with a singular purpose. And no one knew what that purpose was, yet. The truth was becoming impossible to deny. The distress signal wasn't just a cry for help. It was a warning. The galaxy had ignored it for too long, and now it was too late. The darkness that had been quietly creeping toward them was no longer content to stay hidden in the far reaches of space. It was here. And the galaxy had no idea what was coming for them. And as the last known outpost fell silent, the question lingered in the minds of all who had heard the warnings. What was out there? And why had they ignored the signal? Whatever it was, it had already begun its hunt. The galaxy was about to face something far worse than they had ever imagined. The galaxy was on edge, its peace shattered by the growing realization that something was terribly wrong. The last distress signal had been enough to stir action, but by the time the fleet arrived to investigate, it was already too late. The research station was gone, leaving behind nothing but a cold emptiness in the vacuum of space. No debris, no wreckage, not even a faint trace of the once thriving outpost. It was as though the very existence of the station had been erased. The silence that followed was deafening. As the news spread across the galaxy, fear began to take root in the hearts of those who had once thought themselves safe. The military had no answers, no explanation for the sudden disappearance of entire stations. They launched expeditions to locate the missing outposts, but each attempt ended in failure. Another ship, another fleet, vanished without a trace. And each time, the galaxy's leaders grew more desperate, their confidence slipping away. They had dismissed the distress calls as technical glitches at first, but now they were faced with the cold reality that something far more terrifying was at play. The sense of dread that had been simmering in the background was now impossible to ignore. Scientists, military commanders, and even the average citizens of the galaxy whispered about the unknown force that seemed to be sweeping across the stars. It wasn't just an enemy. They couldn't even comprehend what they were up against. No one had seen anything like it before. It didn't operate by any known rules of combat, didn't seem to follow any recognizable patterns. It moved through space with an eerie precision, striking at will and leaving nothing behind but the haunting echo of vanished lives. Days turned into weeks, and the galaxy's leaders scrambled for answers. They turned to their best minds, brilliant scientists and strategists who had once prided themselves on their understanding of the universe. But no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't make sense of what was happening. All the technology, all the military power at their disposal seemed useless against this unknown enemy. Weapons that had once torn through enemy fleets with ease were now rendered impotent in the face of the mysterious force. Ships disappeared into nothingness, as if the very fabric of reality itself was being torn apart. In the face of such overwhelming fear, the leaders of the galaxy made one final decision. They would not wait for another outpost to fall. They would take the fight to this unknown enemy. A massive fleet was assembled, a force unlike any seen before, one that would confront whatever dark power had set its sights on the galaxy. With every ship outfitted with the latest technology, The fleet was ready for anything, or so they thought. The ships launched into the deep void, heading toward the last known coordinates of the missing stations. As they traveled through the emptiness, an unsettling feeling crept over the crew members. It was as though the darkness itself was watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. The void between stars had never seemed so vast, so oppressive. No one spoke much during the journey, and those who tried to remain optimistic found themselves growing uneasy. When they finally arrived at the coordinates, the sight that greeted them was beyond what they had expected. The station was gone, just as the others had been. But this time, something was different. There was a dark presence in the air, a pulse of energy that seemed to vibrate through the very core of space itself. It wasn't just the station that was missing. It was the surrounding area. The very fabric of space felt wrong, as if the stars themselves had dimmed in fear. The fleet's sensors couldn't make sense of what they were seeing. It was as if reality itself had been altered. The commander of the fleet ordered the ships to hold position, but before anyone could react, the darkness descended. A shadow stretched across the fleet, a vast, swirling mass of blackness that seemed to devour the stars in its wake. The ships fired their weapons, but their blasts disappeared into the void, absorbed by the darkness with terrifying ease. No one understood what was happening. The darkness seemed to have no form, no substance. It was a presence, not a thing that could be fought. And then, a single voice cut through the chaos. It was a signal, one that had been sent out from the very center of the black void. A voice that was cold, ancient, and filled with a quiet, terrifying power. The words were simple, but they struck fear into the hearts of all who heard them. You have ignored the warning. Now, you will pay. The fleet's communication systems crackled with static as the shadow continued to spread, overwhelming the ships one by one. No matter how they tried to escape, no matter how fast they moved, the darkness followed. It was as if it had a mind of its own, a sentience that could track and hunt them down with brutal efficiency. The ships that tried to flee were overtaken, their engines sputtering out, their crews screaming in terror as they were pulled into the vast emptiness. The last transmission from the fleet was a single broken cry for help, fading into silence as the darkness consumed them all. The galaxy was now on the brink of something unimaginable. Whatever force had attacked the outposts and destroyed the fleets was no longer hiding in the shadows. It was here, and it was only a matter of time before it reached the heart of the galaxy. The question was no longer if the galaxy would survive, but how much longer it could last before it was consumed entirely. The fear that had gripped the galaxy spread like wildfire. News of the fleet's disappearance and the ominous message that preceded it left the citizens of every planet in a state of panic. Even those who had been skeptical of the earlier distress signals could no longer deny the truth. Whatever this force was, it was not a simple enemy. It was a dark, unstoppable presence that seemed to defy everything the galaxy had ever known. Governments scrambled to form alliances, calling on every available resource to prepare for a war they didn't understand. Military leaders gathered to discuss strategies, but there were no answers. How do you fight an enemy that didn't fight back in the traditional sense? How do you combat a force that could erase entire fleets in a blink without ever firing a shot? There was no enemy to target, no weak spot to exploit. All they knew was that the darkness was growing closer, and there was no safe place to hide. In the midst of this growing panic, a small group of scientists and engineers proposed an idea, an untested, desperate idea. They believed the key to understanding this force lay in the signals that had been sent from the stations before they vanished. If they could somehow decrypt the transmission from the last fleet, they might uncover something that would give them an edge. But time was running out. The fleet had been wiped out in less than a day, and it was only a matter of time before the darkness reached the heart of the galaxy itself. With little choice, the galaxy's leaders approved the plan. A research team was assembled, including the brightest minds from across the galaxy, who had previously been working on separate projects. They quickly set to work on analyzing the data left behind by the fleet, piecing together the fragments of the final transmission. It was a painstaking process, with hours of silence punctuated only by the faint hum of their equipment. The breakthrough came late one night. A young scientist, barely out of her teens, discovered something unusual in the patterns of the signals. She found a hidden frequency, one that seemed to repeat within the static. It was faint at first, barely perceptible, but after hours of amplification and decoding, it became clearer. The signal was not random. It was a message. And more chillingly, it wasn't just a distress call. It was a warning. The decoded message was unlike anything they had anticipated. The words were broken, distorted, and jumbled, but there was enough to understand the gist of it. We are the last. The darkness, never ending. It consumes all. It is already here. The scientists were stunned. The transmission had spoken of the darkness as if it were a living entity, a force that had existed for eons. But what did it mean, the last? The team couldn't decipher the rest of the message, but one thing was clear. This was not some mindless enemy. This was something ancient, something far older than the galaxy itself, and it had been waiting for its moment to strike. As the message played over and over, the realization hit them like a cold slap. The darkness wasn't just a force of destruction, it was a predator. And the galaxy was its prey. Whatever it was, it had consumed countless worlds before, perhaps in other galaxies or in other times, and now it had turned its hunger. The galaxy had always been a place of wonder and discovery, but now it was suffocating under the weight of an impending doom that no one fully understood. As the last fleet disappeared into the void, a deep, unsettling silence fell over the galaxy. The governments, the military, the once proud scientific community, all were scrambling to make sense of the growing catastrophe. What had once been a peaceful, interconnected civilization was now a place of fear and uncertainty. Every corner of the galaxy, every planet, was at risk, and no one knew what to do. In the weeks that followed, reports of strange phenomena began to surface. Planets on the fringes of known space started to experience inexplicable disturbances. Star systems that had once been quiet suddenly erupted in chaos. Civilizations that had lived for millennia in harmony with their surroundings now found their cities and colonies slowly collapsing. Technology began to fail without warning, power grids shorted out, and communication systems were jammed with static. The galaxy was slowly unraveling, but no one knew how or why. A deep sense of helplessness settled over the galaxy's population. Entire civilizations watched in horror as their worlds began to crumble. Governments and leaders held emergency meetings, but they had no solutions. The dark force that had consumed the fleets, the stations, and the outposts was moving with a deliberate, unstoppable pace. It was no longer just a few scattered incidents. This was an extinction-level event. The darkness was devouring everything, and all attempts to fight back had failed. But among the chaos, a small group of scientists refused to give in to despair. They had come together after the destruction of the fleet, determined to find any possible way to stop the darkness before it consumed them all. This group, made up of the most brilliant minds from across the galaxy, was headed by an enigmatic figure, a former military strategist who had once been hailed as one of the galaxy's greatest tacticians. After his defeat in a series of failed battles, he had disappeared, leaving behind his past and a reputation in ruins. But now, in the face of the unknown, he had returned, offering his expertise for the first time in years. The team had a single goal: find out what the darkness truly was. There was no time for uncertainty, no room for mistakes. They had to know what they were up against, and more importantly, how to stop it. Their research had already uncovered some disturbing facts about the Force. It wasn't simply an enemy that could be defeated. It was an entity, an ancient presence that had existed long before the galaxy's rise to prominence. They theorized that it had been dormant for millennia, hidden deep within the fabric of space, waiting for the right moment to awaken. The scientists had started to notice patterns in the disturbances. The Force wasn't just consuming worlds, It was manipulating reality itself. It bent space-time, erasing entire histories, and rewriting the events as though they had never occurred. Whole populations were wiped from existence, and the galaxy's history was being rewritten in real time. What was once known as truth was now being obscured by a growing veil of darkness. As the scientists gathered data, they began to form a terrifying theory. The darkness wasn't just targeting military outposts or remote research stations. It was consuming the very essence of existence itself. Entire star systems were being erased, their very memory wiped from the universe. The records, the achievements, the stories of the civilizations that had lived there, gone. It was as if reality itself was being rewritten by some malevolent hand, erasing everything that had ever been. But there was something else, a deeper connection between the darkness and the galaxy's deepest mysteries. The ancient texts and artifacts that had been discovered on various planets hinted at a truth that no one had ever dared to consider. The galaxy had always been searching for the origin of life, the force that had created the stars and planets, the source of the universe's power. And now, it seemed that this force, whatever it was returning. It had been waiting, hidden, for an opportunity to reclaim what it had once created. The group of scientists realized that they weren't just facing an external threat. They were up against something far more ancient and complex than any of them could have ever imagined. This darkness was not merely a destructive force. It was a part of the galaxy itself, a force that had once shaped the very fabric of the universe. And now it had returned to take back what it had lost. As the last vestiges of civilization crumbled, the scientists proposed a desperate plan. If they could somehow access the hidden knowledge buried deep within the galaxy's oldest records, they might uncover a way to stop the darkness. They had to find the source, the heart of the force, and destroy it before it could consume the rest of the galaxy. The plan was risky, even suicidal. They would have to travel to the farthest reaches of space, to the place where the darkness had first emerged, to face the heart of the void. But the researchers had no other choice. The galaxy was already crumbling. They had nothing left to lose. With the plan in place, the team boarded a specially outfitted ship, one capable of withstanding the rigors of the journey into the unknown. Their ship was designed to be the last line of defense against the encroaching darkness, equipped with advanced shielding and experimental technologies designed to disrupt the force's grip on reality. As they made their way toward the heart of the void, the crew could feel the weight of the unknown pressing down on them. The darkness was growing closer, its presence more oppressive with every passing moment. It was as if the void itself was aware of their mission, aware of their plan to stop it. And it was watching, waiting, ready to strike at the first sign of weakness. The ship's sensors detected a strange disturbance as they neared their destination, an energy signature that was unlike anything they had ever encountered. It was as though the ship was being pulled toward something, drawn by an invisible force. Despite their best efforts to maintain control, the ship's systems began to fail. Lights flickered. Communications went dark. The crew felt the ship begin to vibrate under the pressure of the disturbance. Then, in the distance, they saw it, the heart of the void, a massive swirling mass of blackness that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. It was not just a shadow. It was a living, breathing thing, and it was waiting for them. The moment they arrived, the ship was enveloped in the darkness. Time seemed to distort, and reality itself began to warp. The crew braced themselves for the worst. They had no idea what awaited them in the heart of the void, but they knew this was their only chance to save the galaxy. The question remained, would they survive long enough to learn the truth about the darkness, or would they, too, become part of its endless, consuming void? As the ship approached the center of the void, time itself seemed to stretch and buckle, as though the very laws of the universe were being rewritten. The crew's senses were assaulted by an overwhelming pressure, like the weight of the entire galaxy bearing down upon them. The void was alive, more than just darkness. It pulsed with an unnatural rhythm, a heartbeat that reverberated through the very core of space. It wasn't just an absence, it was something that felt conscious, as though it had a mind of its own, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The ship's hull groaned under the pressure. The crew scrambled to keep systems operational, but one by one, their instruments failed. The once gleaming displays flickered and sputtered, leaving behind nothing but distorted patterns and static. The lights above their heads dimmed, casting the bridge in an eerie half-darkness. Despite their best efforts, the crew couldn't help but feel an overwhelming sense of dread creeping over them. Then, with a sudden, jarring lurch, the ship broke through the last layer of distortion. They were inside, the heart of the void. What lay before them defied all logic and comprehension. The very fabric of space seemed to warp and twist. Stars were swallowed whole, disappearing into the blackness as though they never existed. Space itself bent in unnatural angles, folding in on itself, creating vast chasms of emptiness. The crew stared in horror, realizing that they weren't just facing a force of destruction. They were inside something ancient and incomprehensible, a force that was not simply consuming the galaxy, but unraveling it from within. And then, from the heart of the swirling mass, a voice echoed. It was not a voice they could hear with their ears. It was a presence that spoke directly into their minds. It was cold, ancient, and utterly devoid of mercy. The words were like a blade of ice cutting through their thoughts. "You should never have come." The words were simple, but the weight of them was crushing. The crew's minds reeled as the realization hit them. This was not just a creature, an entity, or a phenomenon. This was something older than the stars, older than the galaxies themselves. It was a force of nature, born from the very beginning of time, and it had been watching the galaxy for millennia. It was the darkness that existed before light, the void that had consumed countless worlds and civilizations across the universe's history. The captain, a seasoned warrior who had fought battles across the galaxy, stood frozen. His body trembled, not from fear of death, but from the recognition that this was an enemy beyond his understanding. This was no mere conflict, it was a reckoning. The entity, or whatever it was, seemed to sense their terror. The blackness shifted and writhed, and the crew could feel something reaching out toward them, its presence pressing in from all sides. The ship's shields flared as they tried to repel the force, but they were useless. The very air seemed to thicken, as if the ship itself was being crushed under the weight of the void's consciousness. Suddenly, the ship's systems began to fail entirely. The engines sputtered and died, leaving them adrift in the heart of the void. Panic spread through the crew. They tried to contact the galaxy for help, but there was nothing. No signal reached out. The galaxy, their civilization, their entire reality, seemed so far away, like a distant dream they could no longer touch. In those final moments, one of the scientists, the young woman who had first decoded the distress signals, looked up from her console with a look of realization. She whispered, almost to herself, "It's not just consuming the galaxy, it's rewriting history." The others turned to her, but she continued, "It's not trying to destroy us, it's erasing us. Erasing everything we've ever been. The station, the fleets, they were all part of this. It's a force that feeds on reality itself, not just our lives." As the truth sank in, the blackness seemed to shift once more. It was as if the entity had been waiting for this realization. The ship's final transmission came through, a desperate plea for help from the crew's communications officer. But before the last words could be spoken, they were cut off, swallowed by the void. The ship, along with the crew and their desperate plea, was absorbed into the blackness. Nothing remained of them. No wreckage, no remains, not even a trace of their existence. The darkness simply moved on, as if nothing had ever been there at all. And then, just as swiftly as it had come, the void receded. It left behind silence, a silence that stretched across the galaxy, deep and unsettling. The galaxies that had once flourished in the light of stars now seemed empty, as if the stars themselves had dimmed in mourning. The void had not just taken their ships, their fleets, or their lives. It had taken something far worse: their history. Back in the heart of the galaxy, civilizations continued to collapse. The distress signals had become meaningless, lost in the void that had claimed them all. The galaxy was slowly fading into nothingness, erased by a force no one could understand. What was left of the survivors was a shell of a galaxy, haunted by the knowledge that nothing would ever be the same again. And somewhere, in the vast, infinite darkness, the entity waited, patient, endless, watching. It had already moved on to other parts of the galaxy. The darkness was no longer just an external threat. It was a part of everything, a living force that could never be stopped. The galaxy had ignored the warnings. It had believed itself safe, immune to the unknown forces that existed beyond their comprehension. Now, the price was clear. The galaxy was gone, not just in body, but in spirit. And as the stars began to disappear, so too did the memory of the once great civilizations that had lived beneath their light. The only thing left was the blackness, and the endless, echoing silence of a galaxy that had been erased from existence.